So last week was the APS March meeting in San Antonio, Texas. I was part of the meeting. They had an LGBT roundtable meeting on Wednesday, and one of the things that they talked about was IGenSpectrum. As it happens to be, and you all know, we're the first LGBT group in the country. Just last year, APS created an ad hoc committee to, investigate what's happening in the LGBT community in physics, and the things that students who are LGBT face in physics. And this committee was the one that was hosting the roundtable at APS, and they wanted, information from us, and they were asking questions of how can we help the LGBT community and other minority groups in physics, and they mentioned IGenSpectrum as a model to follow for every other department. And before I left, there were two guys from Johns Hopkins University who came and talked to me and said that they wanted to do something similar at their university. So that is pretty cool. I guess I'm just gonna give you. You can start now.
So, as you can see, I don't have any slides, so I'm gonna write some stuff on the blackboard going along. It'll become painfully obvious in about 3 minutes. I have never ever spoken about LGBT issues in physics to a public audience. I thought I'd be nervous, but I'm not. I'm actually really excited. I think this is a great opportunity, so I'm really happy that you guys asked me to come and talk about, you gave me no agenda, but I can talk about anything. I have a research presentation all prepared. So when we're talking, you guys could ask me any questions you want whatsoever, so I'm totally happy to answer anything that you guys have. And I do mean this to be a discussion, so I'd much rather have questions back and forth than me just standing up here talking. And it'll be really short if I just talk through all my notes. So, I want to talk initially a little bit just about identity and identity threat, and this is something many of you know. A lot of the ideas I'm going to be taking are going to be stolen initially here directly from Claude Steele's book, Whistling Vivaldi, which a lot of you know. I just found out Claude Steele is talking next Wednesday, 4:30? 4 o'clock.
And then 6:48.
That's right. So he's talking about stereotype threat, which I think will be really fascinating to talk. So we're really lucky to have Claude Steele here as our executive vice chancellor and provost of the university. So I'm hoping that under his leadership we'll be able to make some major advances in terms of diversity and alleviating some stereotype threat on campus. So let me just start talking about identities and identity conventions, and then we'll get into physics, how this affects physics. So identities, we all have many different identities, right? And some of them are visible, and some of them are completely invisible. And just think about what are obvious visible identities. Then the ones that usually come to mind, of course, are age is a good one. Your gender, and here I mean your physical gender, not necessarily what you identify with. Your race, as opposed to ethnicity, which will go on our list of invisible identities. And another one which often gets overlooked is physical disabilities. If those are expressed in a way that is obvious to people. So one thing about visible identities versus what we could call invisible identities or hidden identities this stuff. I could have called it alpha and beta physics audience, but I'll try to stick with actual words here. So, visible identities. So, we have many more invisible identities than we do our visible identities. And our visible identities are actually the ones that make us unique, they make us interesting, and they're a really important part of who we are as beings. So this list could be very long, but I wanted to start it off with one that is perhaps not an obvious invisible identity, but it's one that almost all of us in this room share, which is scientists. So, you're all scientists. That is not a visible identity. It's something that we often have to tell people at parties. Depending on how many beers I have, I'm usually more or less enthusiastic about folks. Lead to interesting party conversations. This is an interesting identity because this is an assumed identity for anybody watching this building. It's assumed that they're a scientist, and we're going to talk some more about assumed identities. And this is a key one. And it's also key because historically, I think we in the physics community, and when I say physics, I mean STEM in general, think that that's the only identity that should matter. So it doesn't matter about your gender or your race, just that you're a scientist. That's all that matters. I think that's a really dangerous and ineffective way of viewing identities, so we'll get back to this. But that is an identity, and it's one that we have to keep in mind. So let me just make a quick list here of other ones. I'm sure we can do this all night long. There's gender identity, which is not necessarily the same as your actual physical gender, of course. There's your ethnicity, which I said which is opposed to your race, which is often visible, but ethnicity could be a separate issue. Of course, while we're primarily here tonight, is sexual identity. That and I think gender identity brings a lot of folks into this room, perhaps. Religion, there's a whole lot of them here. There's spouse, parent, I'll put a good one up here, artist. That was about my list. Very good. Thank you. So, yes, let me put those on here before I run out of room. So, I put on here learning disabilities, which is learning difficulties. And I will also put on here mental health issues, which doesn't sound like an identity, but I'm not an English professor, damn it. So those are many things that can go into creating your identity or anyone's identity. And these invisible identities can be made visible, of course, either by choice or perhaps not by choice. If something about your identity or is revealed, more. So in a place like the department, my discussion mostly wants to focus around the department. Whether we feel comfortable or whether we decide to express these invisible identities depends a lot on the environmental cues. Around us. So I think this term is pretty self-explanatory, but environmental cues just means that you've got signs that your identity is either welcome in your environment or signs that feel threatening about your identity in your environment. And so environmental cues are very key to whether you feel comfortable admitting that we're a scientist or we're LGBT, or that we're Catholic, or et cetera, in the environment. So there are lots of examples we can go through. One of the well-known examples from this department, which came as a shock when the faculty found out, was that it still exists. We don't have any women's bathroom on the second floor of the building. That's completely a negative environmental cue to women, right? That they were not important enough when we were designing this building to give them a bathroom on the second floor. So that's something we hopefully will work on as we go forward. But that was kind of a shock when people thought that was attention. So another one that I walk by every day, and I have a love-hate relationship with it, is our Nobel laureate wall down there on the first floor, right? Lots of really old white men. So mixed feelings about that, right? Because it kind of, we want to advertise our Nobel laureates, but they're not particularly representative of the identities as a whole that we are trying to promote in the department. So environmental issues are really important for making people feel comfortable or not comfortable, especially in the environment. And that leads to the idea of identity safety. Which of course means that whether you feel comfortable expressing a given identity in the department or in whatever environment you're in. So, so if you have enough positive environmental cues, well, let me first say that it'll probably be impossible to ever remove all negative environmental cues regarding any of these identity issues. But we don't have to remove them all. We have to remove the obvious ones that hopefully provide enough positive environmental cues that people feel safe in expressing their identities. And I'll go into more why I think that's really important, that people feel safe to express their identities in the department. But identity safety doesn't mean that we are alleviating all signs of homophobia or sexism or racism in the department. It's that we are showing through the environmental cues that these are valued and welcome identities in our environment. So, like I said, many invisible identities are revealed by personal clues, so I'll use myself as an example. So, you can probably tell by how I'm dressed that I'm a professor. I'm a shock to anybody in this room. If you look closely, am I? Other hand. Yeah, so most people here know I am a domestic partner, but we are not married. I do not feel comfortable wearing a wedding ring since I'm not officially married. This goes to the fact we've been together for 19 years and well before marriage was legal. So, and I'm not rushing to get married, but you can talk to me about that later. But that's a pretty big clue that I'm not married. But I am in a domestic partnership, which is why we're in the right hand ring, which is really weird. I don't know. Only got 2 ring fingers, so. Yes.
Have you ever met anybody else who does that? Is that a thing, or are you just doing it?
I don't think it's a thing. I've been asked if it's a thing. I don't think it's a thing. And Europeans wear their wedding ring on the right hand side. Yeah?
It is a thing.
It is a thing!
You're right.
Did I create that thing? It's not my thing. It's still a thing, okay. So, good question. Other things. So, most people know I wear my earrings in the apartment. What the fuck? I'm told to be wearing earrings. Why do I do that? Well, I don't know why I do that. I think it's primarily because identity contingencies, which we'll get to in a second, which is that, it's, to me, these are obviously related to me being gay, so I like to have some visible indication when I meet people that, well, at least they probably should not make complete assumptions about me until they get to know me a little bit better. So, I don't know if this is the best way of doing it. I could get maybe a rainbow flag. But mostly I just think obviously a way that I'm expressing my identity, my invisible identity, at least making people question it. Now, my issue with STEM fields in general, when it comes to invisible identities, deals with this assumption, which we'll come back to, that most faculty have and most advisors have, most mentors have, that the only identity that matters in science is the scientist's identity. And that the way to succeed in STEM fields is to ignore every single thing else and only focus on the scientist's identity. And I don't think that's particularly effective, and there's a lot of evidence to show that at this point. But that is where, for example, most of my faculty colleagues, I would say, I hate to put thoughts in their heads, but this is where they're coming from when they are thinking about mentoring students. So it's all about your identity as a scientist going forward, and these other things should not matter. It shouldn't matter when we are looking at job applications, it shouldn't matter when we're thinking about postdocs or students coming in our group. But the problem is that none of us forgot about our identities when we entered this building. We all carry our identities with us at all times. So, and they might not be important to the person we're talking to, but they're pretty damn important to us. And they definitely make up part of our being and part of why we're there and why we're here doing science. So I think this is not a successful way at a university in STEM fields. So identities are important and they need to be recognized. And they affect our decisions and they affect other people's perceptions of us. So I think it's much better to acknowledge them and actually discuss them than to try to keep them invisible. And I'll hopefully help convince you that as we're going along. So I want to do another social psychology term, which is identity contingencies. So most of you probably know these terms better than me, but give me a chance to review them. So identity contingencies are things that we need to deal with either on a regular basis or on an occasional basis due to the fact that we have some identities. So, this takes time and it takes energy to deal with these identity contingencies. So, I had an example. I was checking into a hotel this weekend with my family, and when we got there, they had messed up the reservation. So, I was with my partner, and we have two adopted kids, a boy and a girl. They are both Latino, and they are racially, obviously, very different from me and my partner. And hotel, we got there, they messed up our reservations, they're giving our rooms away, and so they had to come up with the rooms for us. And they were just clueless. So they originally put us in 4 separate rooms, completely spread out across. Oh, the context is I had just driven there. I was really tired. I got to eat. I was really, really hungry, and I wasn't thinking myself. So I was just like, just get us a new room. So first they put us in 4 different rooms, all the way spread out across the complex. And I said, no, these my kids, they need a single room. So then they put us in. They put me and my partner in rooms with 2 beds, and finally I realized what was going on, and then I stopped and I calmed down, and I knew there was food around the corner. So I had to explain, these are my kids, they're adopted, but they are my kids, this is my partner, we do want to sleep in the same room, we probably want to sleep in the same bed, even though we've been together for a long time. But I'm pretty used to it by now. And they're my kids, so I don't want them all the way across the whole complex. I want them here with us, so I can keep an eye on them. Otherwise, they'll stay up till 6 a.m. playing their PSs. So, but that was an identity contingency. It was because I'm LGBT, so do you have an example of a good one?
I think there are plenty that I think if you're in an environment that values diversity, then you could use your identity contingency to bring new perspectives to the table. That's a general example, but.
In fact, I would say, yeah, I would say there are a lot of identity contingencies that people just take for granted that are, this is a completely new term, so.
I think in his book, though, he kind of defines it as these are the things we notice when our identity is under threat, actually. So just in this technical where
I don't think it has to necessarily be under threat. It just has to be, it's something you have to do because you have a given identity. So I think it usually expresses itself because it's a identity that's out of the norm. So. I don't think that by itself that this is a negative term, so. But certainly when it turns into threat, identity threat, then that's usually a negative term. So. Okay, so this one. So in terms of STEM fields, I'll come back to some statistics in a minute. Especially for students, we have really limited statistics, and the only identities that have really been studied in even marginal detail for students in, well, I shouldn't say that. These identities have been studied quite extensively for students in STEM fields. Effects of gender and race, or not necessarily effects, but the statistics of how many students are getting degrees or in the field. And most of the other ones are fairly unstudied, so we do have to make a lot of analogy to gender identities and to racial and ethnic minorities when we're trying to talk about some of these identity issues, especially with LGBT students. One thing about identity contingencies, and especially threat, which we'll come back to as well, is that these exist whether you're out or not. So we still have to deal with contingencies around our identity, whether they are invisible or whether they are visible identities. So whenever I'm walking down a hallway, random strangers, I hear some gay joke, I have to deal with that. That's an identity contingency. It didn't matter that I was out or not at the time, so it's something that I had to deal with just because I was in the environment at the time. Question. So lots of different identities here. Who here is a musician? That's a nice identity. Sort of. What do you play?
I used to play guitar a lot.
Yeah, that's awesome.
All my practice stuff.
Okay. So there's a lot of musicians here. That's great. Let's see that. So that is a invisible identity. How many people here are heterosexual? Like sex with people of the other gender? That's great. Isn't that an awkward question? Yeah, really awkward asking that. So I imagine people answering that felt pretty awkward as well. So there's something about our sexual identity that is instantly gets us embarrassed, and somehow there's shame associated with that. And I don't know. We're all adults here, so this is not something that I think everybody has sexual identity, whether you're straight, whether you're gay, queer, whatever. It shouldn't be something that we're ashamed of or need to feel embarrassed by. So it's just a part of our identity, who we are. But it's really difficult to talk about it. So I'm hoping that somehow we can. One of the goals I hope that IGenSpectrum can help address is having more of these conversations in the departments and on our campus, especially in this community. Okay, so some statistics. And some things that have concerned me when I was doing a little research in preparation for this talk. So you're already looking at the clock. How much time do I have?
Oh, you're good. Keep going.
All night long. Okay, so there's a real shortage of statistics for LGBT students and researchers in STEM fields. So there's some out there, but we have to look pretty hard for them, and we also have to make a lot of analogies with other fields. So certainly, for trends, we can look towards women and racial and ethnic minorities. We know the numbers on those. Women make up about 20% of PhDs in physics. Minorities are around 3 to 5% annual count, so it's pretty abysmal. So, and I'll come back to this later. That's after many, many years of promoting diversity through saying that other identities don't matter. So this is why I think this is a failed approach, and that we really need to take a little bit more of a progressive approach to appreciating identities as a whole being in STEM fields. So let me just talk about a couple of results from surveys. Some of you probably know these. There's a Campus Pride survey, which was done in 2010. That surveyed 279 LGBT faculty, so this was a faculty survey. 130 of them were in STEM fields, so not a huge amount of statistics on this. So they found a really surprising result, or it might be surprising, I'm not sure. One of their results was that out faculty, so faculty were out in their department to their colleagues, were much more likely, and this was 70% of the out faculty, to say they were uncomfortable in their department. So, so that's a huge number, so 70%. So in our department, that's me, so one. I don't know if I'm comfortable or uncomfortable. Well, yeah, I'm here, so.
Do you know how this question was asked?
So that's a really good question. So, and we'll come back to that in a second.
Okay.
There's a later survey. This survey is called Queer in STEM. It was done in 2014. And this was done not just for professors, but it covered students, it covers professional researchers. So it was about 1,400 STEM professionals. And they found two things. The first one, which relates directly to this question, was that there was a very strong correlation between participants who said their workplace was welcoming, and they were much more likely to be out. So those seem to be inconsistent with each other. That people who are out say that they feel the exact word is uncomfortable, but the people who say their departments are welcoming are much more likely to be out. So welcoming but uncomfortable. So the question is, are those inconsistent with each other? Probably not. It goes back to the fact it's kind of, it might actually go hand in hand, right? So the fact that you're out, you're in a welcoming environment, you're more likely to be out, but then that leads to more uncomfortable conversations. So that's not necessarily inconsistent. So maybe that's just something that we have to live with. For starters, at least, as we want to come out and become more visible, that we're going to feel a little bit uncomfortable. We all grow up and get over this phase we're going through. I'm feeling some kind of shame around our sexual identities. So there was another really interesting statistic out of that Queer in STEM survey, which was that very large majority of the participants in that survey were out to their families and friends. So I didn't add up the bar chart, but it was probably around 90% or more. But only about 50% of the participants were out at work. So that means there was a very large number of participants, 40% or so, who were completely out at home, their friends and family. They said they were very comfortable being out. They were completely in the closet at work. So, which is, I think, kind of surprising. Yes?
I hate to move backwards, but something that you said about feeling uncomfortable, the dissonance between welcoming and feeling uncomfortable. I wouldn't have thought of the reason that you cited, which is internal, but my experience a lot has been external, in that people who are welcoming, think they're welcoming, and want to be welcoming, but are actually really terrible at being welcoming.
I agree.
And so you may feel welcome, right, but the host doesn't offer you water when you enter the house, right? You know what I mean? Something
I like
that,
yeah, absolutely.
So I just wanted to point out that I think it could be external.
Yeah, and in fact, I'll come back to a similar point in a few minutes. So yeah.
How comfortable did the closeted people feel?
Did the what?
Did the closeted faculty feel?
They felt comfortable, which was really bizarre.
So, is it just talking that one has started talking about sex that makes people feel uncomfortable?
Yeah, I think so. Well, I mean that's a big part of it, but obviously, you know, it's how it's so comfort's a funny thing. Is it how comfortable do you feel depends on how comfortable other people feel, right? So it could be that you feel totally comfortable talking about your party weekend or whatever, I don't know, but how other people react to that will affect your level of comfort.
But I think an important corollary to that is that part of the reason that whether it's sexual identity or gender identity, there's any talk of feeling uncomfortable is that, like Hillary said, there's an outward prejudice or bias against it. And so it would make a lot of sense to me if, for example, if I was male in the department, I think I would feel a lot more comfortable because of people's response to me versus being female in the department. And that's not something that I have control over.
Totally.
But for invisible identities, right, being among the expected class, right, changes how people respond to you dramatically.
Yeah.
I do love being in the department. I don't feel that uncomfortable. I'm not.
Okay.
But there is but it makes a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, I have another statistic down here that relates to that. Let me tell you this one first, and then I'll go back. Don't remind me to go back. I'll skip in my notes. So the HRC, the Human Rights Campaign. Thank you. I have the wrong C. They do regularly workplace environments. So they had their most recent one surveys, and the most recent one was in 2014. And so this is not specific to STEM, but in fact we have very little statistics to do what we can. So this was 800 LGBT workers in the workplace environment, and then many non-LGBT workers to get statistics. So they had some interesting statistics. I definitely recommend you take a look at this study if you get a chance. It's very interesting. So something that's consistent with the Queer and STEM survey is that they reported that 53% of LGBT workers are closeted at work. So, which is pretty consistent with the Queer and STEM survey. 35% of those feel compelled. 35% of LGBT workers in general feel compelled to lie about their personal lives on a regular basis, which goes back to identity contingency, identity threat, and that's related to that 80% of workers are regularly asked about their personal lives at work. It's part of the work environment, whether it's considered to be okay or not. So it is a regular part of the environment. This is the statistics I wanted to share. So 81% of non-LGBT workers feel that LGBT people shouldn't have to hide at work, which sounds like a pretty good statistic. But 70% think it's unprofessional to talk about sexual orientation or general gender identities at work. So,
What does that mean?
so that's basically it's okay to be LGBT, but don't talk about it at work. It's not professional, but at work. So that isn't even in STEM. We won't even acknowledge that these identities exist. So, yeah.
Steve, can you? I'm having trouble understanding. You say that. Can you just say it again? Actually.
What I said?
Yeah.
So 81% of non-LGBT workers.
Yep.
Feel that LGBT workers shouldn't have to lie at work. That people should have the right to be out at work. They shouldn't have to lie about their identity. But 70% of the workers,
Of the non-LGBT workers?
of all workers,
Of all workers.
I think that actually includes the LGBT workers. I think it is unprofessional to talk about sexual orientation or gender identity at work. So, so very mixed message, right? And of course, that is a huge negative environmental cue. So, on one hand, 81% sounds great. Please, we want you to be out of work. Talk about it. So I see there one positive cue and one negative cue, and that negative cue way outweighs that positive cue on a daily basis, right? I mean, they attribute this in the survey partly to that most non-LGBT workers, in this case, because we're talking about workers, don't realize that they have a sexual identity themselves and they have a gender identity themselves, and that there are a lot of positive cues in the workplace for them to express those that LGBT workers are not getting. So let me go back to any comments on that. I found that statistics just pretty shocking. So,
Do you think if they said orientation instead of sexual orientation, the numbers would be different?
I don't know.
I think more people will be confused if what they're asking.
What? North, south, east, west?
I mean, is it possible that the way the questions are worded, people interpreted the latter as like, do you find it appropriate to talk about the details of your sexual encounters?
Yeah.
Versus, like,
Absolutely.
it's just such an absurd pair of
And
statistics.
so I do, so actually this is a really interesting study, so I definitely recommend you look at it because they don't just summarize the big questions, they go into depth, so they break it down and why people responded the way they did to the different questions. So it wasn't just, a 5-question survey, it was many questions, responses, and then why they responded the way they did, so it's got some interesting. Yeah.
Was that a survey on sexual orientation specifically, or did it include gender identity? Because you mentioned that they were accepting of LGBT individuals.
This was both.
Okay.
So I believe this was both for the HSC survey. Yeah. Okay. So I'm just trying to talk about some of the statistics that are out there. And so I'm not trying to paint a horrible picture because I think we've got a sunny ending here, but I just wanted to point out a couple other indicators which I think are important. So first, as some of you know, before I was chair, I was for many years graduate advisor, then a head graduate advisor. And we had an external review in 2012, and the external review panel was asking us about diversity and climate in the department. And we gave our presentation, things we're trying, but results aren't so great, but we're still trying, this is important. And one of the panelists asked, are there any LGBT issues in the department? And there's complete silence. No. People just said, no. And I was like, yeah. Based on zero statistics whatsoever, but just the fact that especially when I was head graduate advisor, unfortunately one of the problems being head graduate advisors, you usually have to advise students who are in the late stages of leading the program or very close to leading the program and trying to get them back on track. And disproportionate number of LGBT students by far. I don't have the statistics on that, but I can guarantee you it was not 10%. It was probably over 50%. Yes. So my personal experience as advisor was that LGBT students were feeling very alienated in the department. Now, I mean, for most of them, that was not their only identity, of course, but that was one obvious correlation I saw among many students. So interestingly, I just saw an early draft of the graduate assembly. So the graduate assembly here on campus I think this was last year, they did their survey on graduate student happiness and well-being. Is anybody familiar with this survey that's done by the graduate assembly? I don't know how often they do this. Do you know?
I have taken more than one, and I've been here for 4 years.
Okay, so 2 years maybe, or something like that. I don't think it's every year, but they do it regularly. So this is going to come out soon. A very interesting report on their survey, but two things really stood out. One, so they broke down responses by demographics, including sexual identity and gender identity, even though they're a little sloppy in their report in separating those out. So somebody that's close to the grad assembly might correct them a little bit on their language. But the one thing they found, which was shocking, was that of all their demographics, so the general, all graduate students are miserable. The signs for depressive symptoms is shockingly high, about 47% on average across all demographics. But there was only one demographic that stood out from all the others, and that was LGBT students, which was significantly higher than even that incredibly high average. And so that includes breaking down by gender and by race and ethnicity. So LGBT students were the only ones that stood out as being having both significantly lower life satisfaction and more depressive symptoms than other demographics. So there was also a statistic on whether the students felt less likely to be valued and included in their departments. Get back to this. We include you as scientists, so you're included. So they weren't, at least LGBT students weren't alone in that. The ones that stood out were older students and some racial and ethnic groups and LGBT students. So that'll be a really interesting survey when it comes out. But the news is not great. It's great to have some statistics to actually work with and see that this is not just something that's in our heads. There are real issues for LGBT students. Okay, so it's going long, right? I could do this a long time. So related to identity contingencies is this idea of stereotype threats. So this is what Claude talks about in his book, and we'll talk about next week. And that, of course, is a threat that people feel from their environmental cues to be at risk. And so I have a big, long section on this, which I'm going to mostly skip because I think we've been talking about it. But I think it's not a stretch to think that that stereotype threat is affecting the population of LGBT students and STEM fields in general. So stereotype threat. Let me just actually let me back up for 1 second. That, of course, is just a situation where a person feels at risk just because they're aware that there are negative stereotypes when you walk into the environment. And so this is, of course, become a really widely studied topic in social psychology. There are studies that show that long-term exposure to stereotype threat in academic environments, such as the physics department, can lead students to not value their particular field of studies. So if you're here and you're feeling constant or even very low level stereotype threat over long periods of time, then that is likely to express itself as growing disinterest in physics. So I think that's think physicists or STEM folks in general just want to deny is that stereotype threat exists regardless of whether the identity is visible or not. So you still feel stereotype threat when you walk into an environment, depending on the environmental cues, whether that whether it's regarding a visible identity or an invisible identity. And I think one key point I really want to stress is that a lack of positive environmental cues is a negative environmental cue. So not seeing that you are welcomed in an environment regularly is a sign that you are maybe not welcome in an environment. It's a negative cue. So this idea that we have of just ignoring identities beyond the invisible scientist identity, which is always assumed, is really a negative environmental cue, which I think that we need to train general STEM researchers, staff, and faculty, and our fellow students to overcome a little bit. So then I have to ask: is it really good policy that we in the STEM fields continue not acknowledging these other identities exist? I would say no. We have lots of statistics for specifically women and students of color that, even though their numbers improved over the last few decades, are still abysmally low from where they should be. And I think that in some ways they have been given the same treatment in terms of advising and mentoring that all that matters is your scientist role and not these other identities. So, and certainly this graduate survey, when it comes out, directly shows that LGBT students, that this tactic is not working for LGBT students. Yes?
There's something that I want to add here. I do completely agree with you that the focus is, if you're anything other than a scientist, you're not committed to your field and whatnot. But I do feel like another issue that I've run into with some faculty and, graduate students and whatnot, is that people can be accepting of other identities only if they have them as well. So for example, if my advisor is a musician and I'm a musician, then that's cool if I spend some of my spare time doing music. But if I spend some of my spare time doing something else, that's not okay. And sometimes I wonder if there would be a way to generalize or to leverage people's individual identities to let them use that to see something larger.
That is such a great lead-in. Awesome!
Sorry if I stole your thunder.
Not at all. I think that's a really great point. I think we can come back to it if we want. I'll skip over the effects of stereotype threat. Let's go exactly to the question that Hillary is bringing up, which is kind of related to whether we should be out in the department or not.
Too late.
Too late? Wait, is that thing on? So there's a question, is it better for you? And that, of course, is a personal choice. But there's also the question, is it better for others? And I think there's no question that being out is better for your fellow students and colleagues in the department. And that's because when you're out, you are a positive environmental cue. So you might trigger more negative environmental cues from being out, but you are a positive environmental cues for other students and for the faculty and for the staff. So it's unrealistic that we're going to remove all negative environmental cues in the department. But the more positive environmental cues we can put in, the better we are.
We could continue IGenSpectrum.
That's a big one. That's a huge one. IGenSpectrum is a huge one. Yeah.
I mean, can we play up that Newton was probably gay?
Huh?
Can we play up that Newton was probably gay?
No. Absolutely. Good, yeah. Turing is another one.
Yeah, definitely gay.
Role models, good one. Yeah.
I think transgender or like gender neutral bathrooms would be
Yes.
great, and I also think that parental leave being equalized would may not affect very many people, but would also send a really strong message.
So, equalize.
Maternity leave and paternity leave.
Is it not equal?
Not
Oh.
My understanding is that it's not. I hope I'm wrong.
Perfected.
Okay. That's awesome. Okay.
If you can claim you are 50% or more caregiver for
Okay.
so
Do you have to
that's a
choose?
great question if it's true for grad students. So.
Also
Do we get
include
any
like
kind of-
healthcare and benefits continuing and all of those aspects.
Yes.
Something that I used to see in school was, this was something that individual teachers could opt to do, is they would post in their classroom just a safe space sign. And it was very subtle, but, I mean, if you saw it, you saw it. Now that was high school, but there's no reason why that couldn't be brought into higher education as well.
Absolutely. And in fact, there is a thing called the Safe Zone Project. People know the Safe Zone Project? So I love this idea. So this is something I would propose IGenSpectrum to think about. So the Safe Zone Project is, a lot of schools are doing this, but the idea for a safe zone is that you have basically a training session for mentors or students on just how you mentor LGBT students, what's the language, how it's okay to not say the right thing all the time, but it's, to be generally aware, and you go through it's pretty not so difficult training, but at least brings up all the issues, and then the idea is that, advisors or students go through that, get a little sticker. It says safe zone space, and you put it on your door, and then, when students come and talk to you, they know that you are actually okay. You can talk to me about LGBT issues or gender issues, or I would like to see expand a little bit beyond that to race and ethnicity and any issues that the advisors feel comfortable with, but just to have these useful identities, kind of subtly placed out in front of it, I think would be a nice thing.
So who facilitates this program? Is it through Berkeley?
So actually I know that the Gen Equity Center on campus has a program like that, but I don't think they call it that. But there actually is a thing called the Safe Zone Project, which actually you go online and get all the materials. It looks pretty straightforward. So I think it's an interesting idea. So
since a lot of people don't have doors, and a lot of business is conducted through email and online, it seems like it might be a good idea to have something on the website, like in a directory. Maybe
who is
if people in the department are doing this and getting the sticker, like a virtual version of it.
yeah.
For example, those of us that live in Campbell don't have any doors.
Professors do that.
The professors do, but like the graduates, we don't even have name tags
Oh, wow.
on our desks yet.
I hear we're kidding.
But like that would be a really easy concrete thing to add as like something on the website.
Yeah. Interesting.
Oh, sorry.
Yes.
So the group of people who showed up tonight are largely self-selected. Like we showed up here because we do care about these issues, or at least would want to learn more, or are interested in these issues. But so we're like a pretty self-selected group. But a lot of the people who don't show up today maybe don't care as much about these issues, but are the ones that need to be reached like more. So I don't know if there's like mandatory, I know there's already like the mandatory like ethics training for GSIs, and there's but I don't know if there could be a more mandatory, maybe like more provocative thing, because I know a lot of people like come, to Berkeley and they're like already very self-selected to get into a program like Berkeley's, and I don't know, how do you reach a lot of the people at this level?
Responses to this.
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
No, that's great.
So I know right now, at least on the undergraduate side of things, Swift is working on trying to introduce a diversity talk lab, something like that, into the 7 series classrooms. And that's in the very, very early stages, but it's diversity in general, not just the gender, even though it's been being indicated by Swift.
Which I think is great.
We're also on the grad level, there's a new law which you might have heard about, been in the news in California, that like is requiring all incoming students to take sexual harassment and sexual assault prevention training. And so physics, we're like sort of trying to get our own thing, which is going to be more broad and more interactive than just someone shouting at you about things like that. So that's also something that's in the works, and we like did a trial run last fall. And I want to talk to you about that.
Yeah, I did a bunch of sexual harassment training in undergrad, and can't recall one single mention of LGBT. Not one.
So, I should add something here. The sexual harassment training that we did last fall, that Sam and Simka organized, I was. Oh, sorry, Ali. So I actually participated in the one-to-one section or whatever that we did, the second half of the program, and I made sure that they selected one of the examples that they have to discuss what related to LGBT issues. So everyone who took that, we were able to discuss LGBT-related issues in that training. So, that could be something that we'll do in the future, is keep doing that, like include not just sexual harassment when it comes to like a man attacking a woman, but also like other things that could happen with LGBT students, or a woman harassing a man or something, all the things that could happen, right? Yeah, so it's something that we can work on.
I think it'd be really cool if this type of thing was made maybe like more broad, not just to include sort of like the more maybe like violent or like, but even just like, because I mean, like these things do exist and they happen to a lot of people, but many people more like face these everyday sort of identity contingency issues, and it would be really cool if like in that type of mandatory setting you could just like provoke the questions that like make people start to think about like what is it like to not be the normal whatever person. I think that's would be an interesting thing to like bring up.
I agree
all
with
of this.
you.
Yeah.
I think
But
Berkeley.
I think that's very necessary, but it's not.
I think Berkeley is one of the best places, at least of the schools I visited during the open house, when it comes to things like gender and diversity and all that. Other schools are not. That's why I'm here. Other schools, I was talking to someone during the APS conference, and they have no clue what stereotype trends were. Or, other schools don't really talk about these issues as much. And as a result, they have only 5 or 10% women on their, on their grad student body, and they may have like 1 or 2 LGBT students on who at least are out LGBT students who are on their student body, just because they don't talk about these issues with the students. And that's what we're here for. Like we have multiple student groups. There is SWIFT, there is Compass, and there's IGenSpectrum, and we're basically all targeting different populations, but we basically have similar objectives, right? We're trying to make everyone aware of these issues, because in the future you're going to graduate and you're going to go to some other university, right? You're going to be a faculty somewhere else, and you will be bringing that knowledge with you, and hopefully spreading that to other places, right?
Well said.
Yeah, so from a faculty point of view, 2 parts. What are some things that you've already seen done to fix some of these issues? And then going to the future, what are things you want to see?
Wow, that was a great lead-in. That was awesome. I have not seen a lot done on these issues, at least in the STEM field. So, but I think before I answer the second part, I just wanted to make a couple more points. points and then get to that second part. So and that's the question of what are the effects of being out, so those students being out in the department, or faculty being out in the department for that matter. One big effect of that, of course, is that visible identities such as being out induce identity contingencies in even our best and closest allies. So stereotype threat to the allies that they might be perceived as homophobic or racist or sexist if they somehow say the wrong word or respond incorrectly to question or comment that especially a student might have, especially in an advisor-student relationship or mentoring relationship. So, so I think it's really important that part of the reason for this training that we're talking about is to encourage everybody not to avoid these difficult conversations and difficult questions, so to actually meet them head on and not be afraid of actually having these type of conversations. And we need to show, as LGBT students and LGBT allies, that it's okay for people not to get everything right all the time. Sometimes it's okay to be wrong. It's an educational experience, and that's not going to jeopardize people's reputation or their jobs or whatever. It's a learning experience for everybody, and not everybody's going to get everything right all the time. So there has to be some level of trust that is on us as well as our friends and allies to build that trust, to be able to have those difficult conversations. And so I would say that the faculty so far, and if you talk to any individual faculty, they're mildly going to be supportive of the issues. So, but how that's actually played out in the department, I don't think has been particularly visible, primarily for the same reason that we've avoided this for discussions about women and racial and ethnic minorities. That the perception that we have is that these identities don't matter or shouldn't matter, and they should not be something that's out of place. And as the HRC study of general workplaces showed, that's a really negative message to be sending. That is a very bad environmental view. I would love to see if we could get to a point, especially in advising relationships between faculty and students, where it's absolutely okay to acknowledge these identities. It's actually encouraged, and to come up with a level of discussion and dialogue that people feel comfortable with. That's not something that's going to happen overnight, but that is actually the primary point for these type of safe zone training, so that, for example, advisors get the language they need to learn how to make good discussions, and they know what's appropriate responses to people and what's not. So, and that gives them a level of confidence in their own abilities to actually feel okay in these discussions. So it's like practice. Here's a practice discussion. That's not just true of faculty, it's certainly the same as staff, students. I mean, one big thing I think that IGenSpectrum is excellent for, and I want to see it going forward, is more mentoring of undergraduate students and graduate students. And in that role, then, graduate students are playing the role of advisor, and they need to have that same sort of comfort and language with these discussions. So there is a question whether this, whether identity should be a part of mentoring in general and not avoided at all costs during mentoring discussions, and I think that we should have a productive dialogue about that question. So, and also is the Safe Zone project something that we should be thinking about. So IGenSpectrum is incredibly positive environmental cue. Thank everybody here. That's really fantastic. You can see it's a positive cue not just for the department, but for the entire APS Nation. That's really fantastic. In some ways, by IGenSpectrum existing, you actually have already started creating a safe space for faculty, which is incredible because you're telling us that it's okay if we have these conversations. So something that was not, I think, the obvious to most of us in the past. So I think that is a really major step forward, whether it seems like that right now or not. So networking is incredibly important, and one thing I didn't cover through about stereotype threat is that it tends to isolate people. It's very independent, and they don't work in groups. It's really bad for your career. Besides being bad for homework and social life. So that is fantastic to create those networking opportunities here. And I think that the biggest thing that IGenSpectrum can do if it helps do this in the department is to turn this traditional view and spin on its head that these invisible identities should not matter. So I would like to see them actually be acknowledged and encouraged and welcomed and show that they actually do matter for people's
There was a question there.
I was just going to make a comment on, you were saying that it is good to have this kind of positive environmental cue of IGenSpectrum and other things to, in some ways, it doesn't counteract stereotype threat, but to be a second, to be there. And when you were talking about stereotype threat earlier, it was in relation to these statistics where it says like these people, this group of people say that they feel a certain way, and then they feel another way. Then they report feeling another way in those situations. And one of the interesting things that we read in that physics education class is that people often demonstrate the symptoms of the stereotype threat without feeling one way or another.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that that's one of the most interesting things when we're talking about invisible and visible identities and however much we support any particular identity directly is that people can exhibit the symptoms even if they feel most welcome.
Even if they can't identify a specific threat.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. And that might be an avenue into addressing the symptoms as opposed to asking people, do you feel good? Do you feel welcome?
So what question would you pose?
I don't know if I would pose it as a question. It's tricky, right? Because in some ways we reinforce stereotype threat by telling people that you are of a subgroup that doesn't perform well, right? Or historically doesn't perform well. And so I wonder whether, in fact, it's a matter of addressing the situations in which stereotype threat exhibits itself and actually addressing it that way and saying, yeah, so these symptoms, like we call these symptoms because the structure is such that that's where these negative environmental cues emerge. So what if we just change where those symptoms emerge such that they no longer emerge? That would be, that's just like a hypothetical. But it's an interesting, because we talk a lot about like feeling one way and feeling another way. And part of making a welcoming environment, I think, like you're saying, is talking about that. And that often doesn't make people feel very comfortable because there's a reason that people previously weren't talking about, so they make them feel uncomfortable, right? You can't blame people for feeling uncomfortable.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
That's why I think we have to build that trust.
Yeah.
And we also have to have a
Yeah.
level of forgiveness.
Yeah, right. It has to be, it's okay to feel
Educational.
uncomfortable.
Exactly. And control isn't always horrible.
Yeah. Exactly.
Especially if it leads you somewhere else,
Yeah.
right?
Exactly. So anyways, it just seems kind of like an interesting dichotomy between what we report as feeling and how we demonstrate we're actually behaving.
Right.
There's always that contrast.
Excellent. Yeah.
So one of the things we hear a lot about is that a powerful way to fight some of this is have a department that has more diversity of role models. There are people that you can look at the faculty with pictures and you can say, oh, okay, I see people like me, or I feel like I'm to be welcome. So how do how do you get that? How do you build that?
You mean how do we provide that?
Or like how do you, I mean, what are some strategies for building a more diverse faculty, building a more diverse graduate student community?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, man, I wish I had the answer for that.
So
I am convinced putting this question down is key. Whereas actually being able to acknowledge and welcome identities outside of being a scientist would help.
So I've actually asked this question before, and the only actually satisfying answer I got as far as the grad students were concerned was that there's a whole bunch of rules and things that say you can't consider gender or race or LGBT or anything like this while accepting graduate students, right? But what Berkeley and a number of other schools do is they do have you write a diversity statement. And I have no idea if you guys read these.
Of course, absolutely. Are you kidding?
But it's a way of, if you can vocalize these types of things, and it's giving you an opportunity to express that sort of issue.
Just so you know, we have to read those diversity statements not in terms of, is this person diverse? It says this person contributed to increasing diversity in the workplace. So,
these issues.
exactly. So, had a really good point in the middle of what you were talking, related to what you were saying, and now I totally lost it. So.
Oh, I was gonna say that it's really important to always have a role model, and that's something that I think we're missing for the LGBT community in the science. It's like, it's always good to see someone who's like you, who succeeded. Oh, sorry, I might say
No, it's not even me. I was asking if my role models. I have role models.
Yeah, it's always good to see someone who's like you in some sense, who's succeeded in your same field, and it makes you feel good about yourself and say, okay, I can also do it, right? And unfortunately, since we're a minority group, and LGBT issues is something that is, at least in physics, is something that has been started to be talked about like in the past 3 or 4 years, right? Like, the first APS talk about LGBT issues was in 2012, right? So we need role models, and we are the role models. As when we move on to other places by being out and being supportive, then we create that supportive network to undergrads and other groups of people and stuff.
So, wrapping up. So last year this fantastic document came out supporting LGBT plus physicists and astronomers. You guys seen this? Best practices for academic departments, which is really great. I encourage people to read through that, especially the first 2 sections on how to improve the environment in general. And think about that department. I would love to hear feedback on what we can implement here in the department. There's some few things in there that I think are interesting. One is this idea of the Safe Zone program, where you basically can train mentors who feel okay talking about issues on LGBT and gender and race, and let me finish up real fast. Those are things you can facilitate, and this is probably the right group to facilitate that for the department, because that gives a big signal to fellow students and faculty that students are okay with addressing this issue in the department. So the Gen Equity Center could probably help with that, and maybe one of your meetings could be practicing facilitating this group. I don't know. Think about it. There's some recommendations in there about climate surveys and including questions on gender identity and sexual orientation. And I'd be really interested to hear feedback on that. We do regular surveys as students are leaving, but we don't generally do climate surveys in the department, so maybe that's something we should think about facilitating. So, and the last thing that I recommend, which I want to stress, is to recruit LGBT students. next week. The grad students are coming in, so it's your opportunity to shine. I hope you guys have something good planned for that. So.
We do.
We do.
Good. Good answer. So, yes, you would.
I had a question. Shouldn't it be mandatory to take an LGBT training, just as it should be mandatory to take a sexual harassment training? On the other hand, I don't want someone who's not supportive advising anybody. I don't want someone who's, not supportive of LGBTQ allies in the community saying that they're comfortable with it. I wouldn't want someone who's not supportive of like women in the community, But so where's the balance between like you should be able to say that you're supportive? It should be mandatory because like nobody has a right to be a jerk, right? I mean, just But on the other hand, you wouldn't want to put someone in a position of still being on the wrong side of the table.
I agree with that. I'm not sure it's the best strategy to get started.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It's just funny.
Your other point is very good, which is it would be nice to build that ally base and,
I think
get the discussions going in the departments.
One possible approach would be, for instance, to have some kind of mandatory widespread sensitivity training for multiple identities, because clearly not just one identity is having difficulty in our department. But so we have some kind of mandatory sensitivity training, which kind of goes along with sexual harassment training. Maybe everyone would have to go through that. Then there would be a voluntary other program, which would be, yes, I want to be able to
specifically
show my support, talk to people about, things that they may be encountering, things that they may be feeling, and that's when you then
get a sticker.
Get
a sticker.
Get a sticker for the second one.
Yeah, like a mandatory, like call it diversity training, for lack of a better word. But yeah.
So making things mandatory, it's not. I don't think it's the right approach for
you're right.
Spread the word. What we could do is like have the department sexual harassment training be a little bit more wide and talk about diversity when it comes to race and gender and sexual orientation. But having something be mandatory, I don't think that's the right way to do to spread. What we want.
Unfortunately, most things when they become mandatory, it's because there are legal issues that have forced them to be that way, and that's not the way it should be. I agree. So we got to start somewhere. Starting for mandatory for everybody might be a little bit uphill battle, but I'm not disagreeing with you at all. So, but I do think that broader diversity training in the department and making
it shouldn't be an opt-in policy. Is all I'm saying.
No, I agree. So.
Awesome enough. Just make it awesome enough. Nobody doesn't want to do it.
Did I mention stickers?
So I'm interested in your talk. So do you think that maybe this whole focusing on the only thing that should matter is comes from just a too idealistic point of view?
Yes. I don't think there's any ill will at all. I think it's a very idealistic view.
Because I mean, in the long run, wouldn't it be great if none of these other things made any kind of hits on you?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But,
Unfortunately, that's not the world we live in.
right.
So, so I think it's completely built on idealism. So.
The question, it was a little quiet, but sorry. So the point is that the possible issue with this is that we're not like 5,000 years from now.
Right. We're not ready to only consider science.
The question was whether this focus on just your scientist identity when it comes, especially to mentoring and question of jobs and employment and such, whether that comes from, how would you put it?
I said idealism, right?
Idealism.
Just blindness to the fact that all of these other things do affect your scientific prowess in the end.
I think so. Do you think so?
Well, even if we were 5,000 years in the future, I would still want to be able to talk about these other things. That makes me a human being. I like being a human being. Wow.
Well, right, but like say while looking at a job application, right, it would be great if the only thing that actually I had to consider was how many papers they got out and how effective a scientist they were, and that none of these things affected those things, right?
I think the idea is that it would be great if 5,000 years in the future, that by not having the positive environmental cues, we're not actually creating negative environmental cues around us, right? That we can focus on this identity. but it's not being impaired by the fact that you have other identities that aren't being acknowledged. So that would be my premise. Only 5,000 years to wait. So, good. Any other comments or questions? Discussion?
Okay, I have a few comments. One is the American Physical Society is gonna send us a survey this month, and I'm gonna be forwarding that to every single grad student and faculty and postdoc in undergrad. And they're basically, they created this ad hoc committee. It's gonna be basically this ad hoc committee that they created should give the APS results by 2016. So they're gonna send us a survey where they're gonna ask about issues in different departments and what could APS do to increase the number of LGBT students in the physics department or the physics community. And it would be good if you guys could take that survey. Something else that you could do is talk about your friends from classes if you're an undergrad, or someone in your lab if you're a grad student, about IGenSpectrum meetings. And not just IGenSpectrum, also SWIPs and other conferences as well. That we have these meetings every month or regularly, and trying to increase awareness to all the grad students who basically just spend the time in the lab and then go home. To come to these diversity meetings to be aware of this